Hello and welcome to another deep dive. So this time we're going to be taking a look into something called post-processing. So post-processing is a way of applying visual effects on our game, and they, as the name suggests, post-processing, they're applied typically at the end. So they're ways that we can apply things that affect the entire scene, everything we're looking at. And we can use them a lot to really sort of set a nice visual tone for an environment. So I'm initially going to look at that with the built-in render pipeline. Now it does vary depending upon which pipeline you are looking at. So the types of effects are largely the same, but the way those effects work in terms of how you actually go about setting them up is different between the different pipelines. So I'm initially going to take a look at the built-in pipeline, and then we'll go from there. So with doing this, I need to go to Package Manager. So like many things, it's there as a separate package. So I just want to make sure that I've got it installed and make sure that I've got a latest version. So it isn't currently installed, so I'm going to get that installed. I am also going to install Cinemachine because alongside showing the post-processing, I want to also show you how post-processing works working with Cinemachine, and also that's going to bring in a bit of timeline. So if you've seen the deep dives on Cinemachine and Timeline, it's going to be drawing from some of the things there. And if you haven't checked them out, I would recommend checking them out because they will have useful things in them, because that combination of Cinemachine, Timeline, post-processing lets you do some real things, which we are going to be seeing very shortly. All right, so we've got Cinemachine, we've got post-processing, Timeline is already in there. Excellent. So, as always, I need to have a little bit of a scene set up, and I'm going to need some materials. So one of the things I'm going to do with this is going to be my demo scene, just post-processing, because I'm going to have a separate scene then that has the Cinemachine side and things like of that in it. So let's set up our good old standard ground. And that ground, I'm going to give it a material. Now, intentionally with setting up this, I'm going to choose slightly lighter colors for this, just because for a couple of the effects, it's going to make it a little bit easier to be able to see them. So I'm going to have this just be a fairly pale blue color. That will work nicely. And I'm going to have a material for a cube that I'm going to place in the world as well. And that I just want to be in the center there like that. Drag that. Let's try set that up to also a fairly lightish color. It's a fairly pale yellow. Perfect. Okay, so to do a setup post-processing, there's a few different ways of approaching it. And this does actually change depending on whether we're using Cinemachine or not. It doesn't change massively. If we're using Cinemachine, it's still a very straightforward process. But if I'm not using Cinemachine, if I'm just using standalone camera objects, then there's a couple of things I need to do. First thing is, in the scene, I want to go to 3D object and create this post-process volume. So post-processing, we can have different effects apply depending upon where you are in the world. So for example, if you're in an interior environment, we could have one particular set of post-processing effects, and then you go outside and it's a different set. So we can configure these volumes, and then based upon where our camera is, it can just switch between those volumes. We can also have multiple volumes in the same spot and be blending between the different ones, and we'll see how we can actually do that. So this is going to be PPV default. That's what I'm going to call it. And we can see kind of the bounds for it, and we can actually adjust the size of that volume. So I can make it so that it fully encapsulates this area. And I might also want to have like a global set of post-processing is something that I could set up. So having it apply across the entire world, which I won't enable that just yet. Actually, no, for the default one, I will make it a global one. So if I make it global, the actual bounds, you can see how that turns off because it doesn't actually matter. So I'm going to make it a global one. The other thing I'm going to do, that this is a recommended thing, it's a performance benefit, is setting up a layer. So post-processing. So general recommendation is you set up a separate layer for post-processing and your volumes get placed into that layer. This just allows the checking of, well, which volume am I in, to be done a little bit more efficiently. It means it can focus on looking at a layer that all it's got in it is those volumes. So it allows it to be a little bit more quicker in terms of doing that because it's churning through less data. So I've set up my volume. Now I go to my camera, and my camera, type in layer, I can select a post-process layer. And you'll see volume layer, I want to set that to post-processing. So then in here, I can change things like anti-aliasing. So I've got different options I can select there. In terms of configuring the actual visual effects that are happening, that happens on the volume, and it's done using this thing called a post-process profile, which if I go new, it's already created one, and I can see it puts that in a separate folder. So the post-processing for this volume, it's a separate asset. So it means I could reuse that in different locations if I wanted to. It makes it really easy for then sort of doing variations of that as well, because I could take that one and duplicate it. So that data is stored outside of your actual scene. So, okay, I've got that set up. Now I can start adding in effects. So with the volume selected, that's where I can easily configure the effects. And I usually am doing this in the game view. So let's start to look at the different effects. And the easiest way to tell what these effects do is just by testing them out. So let's start with ambient occlusion. Now, nothing has changed. And that's because if we look at it, these settings are currently grayed out, but if we tick these boxes, we'll be able to then override them. And we can see the intensity is currently at 0. So let's click on intensity, so we want to override that, and then we can start to see what happens as we ramp that up. Now, in the game view with our angle there, it's a little bit difficult. So we're going to switch to scene view. Now, scene view, to be able to see post-processing, you need to make sure that post-processing is ticked here. So let's have a look and see what ambient occlusion is doing. So what we can see is areas where we've got these joins, where we've got a connection between surfaces. Ambient occlusion is adding in a bit of a darkening. And that's actually something that if you look at sets of objects in the world, that actually happens. So that's a thing that we notice happening in the real world. And what it does is it helps these things, and I'm going to actually put in a rotated cube just to further illustrate. That looks cool. And let's move that so it's sitting on top like that. Just so we get a few more areas where we've got these shadows. So this is the effect we'll get with ambient occlusion. We get a little bit of shadowing there, and the advantage of it, which if I turn this off, it makes them feel more connected. It makes them feel like these things are actually anchored properly next to each other. That little bit of shadowing that we just expect to be there without realizing that we're expecting it to be there. If it's not there, what can happen is these things can feel like they're floating. In particular, this one on the ground plane really can feel like that's floating there. And as soon as we put on a little bit of the ambient occlusion, then it's just enough to make it feel like it's anchored into that area. We can mess with things like the thickness of that. So there's a lot of different settings we can change. We can change things like the color that's going to be. So you could use this not just for having that natural sort of darkening, but also if you're wanting to create more interesting sort of visual effects there. We can change the type of mode that it's using. So these will have different visual effects and different performance effects. But that gives us a good sort of sense of, well, what does the ambient occlusion do? So in most of the types of games I'm doing, I'm using ambient occlusion because I'm generally doing 3D games. So having that bit of ambient occlusion there really helps make the environment feel cohesive and feel like the pieces in the environment are actually connected. So that's ambient occlusion. So cool. Let's check in the next sort of effect. So auto exposure. If you've used cameras, then that's going to be a little bit more of a familiar thing. It's going to allow you to adjust the exposure, kind of effectively the brightness that you're going to be seeing there. And again, the best way to work out what these effects do and how you can use them is experiment with them. So this, we can see, we can use this for that enhancing the brightness or darkness. Again, similar to what we would see if you've worked with a camera or even your phone camera, adjusting the exposure level. That's what the auto exposure one's going to allow you to do, is going to allow you to be managing that quite nicely. So we've got exposure. Let's keep going through. Bloom. I'm not going to lie, I am a gigantic fan of adding bloom into games. So there's a lot of things that bloom will allow you to do. And so one of the big things is so bloom, if we add it, turn it in and ramp up the intensity. So it effectively, what it's doing is things that are bright are going to be enhanced in that brightness, and that brightness kind of blooms out from that location. So that light, the brightness spreads. So as we can see here, the plane, it becomes much softer and hazier. So that's actually often where I'm using bloom, is to create this soft, hazy feel to the visuals. So if I'm doing something where it's an environment and I want it to feel really sort of almost still, like a summer afternoon where it's just kind of a really warm, perfect temperature where it just is really sort of almost a sleepy sort of temperature. You can do that kind of thing with something like bloom, and starting to, you're looking at something that's more over on the yellowy, orangey sort of side of things. And we need to sort of mess with this intensity quite a bit, but you can get that really sort of subtle, soft, hazy feel to the environment just by ramping up a bunch of bloom. And so it starts to convey a really nice feeling to it. So that's generally where I use bloom, is for softening an environment, and it's really effective at doing that. It can just take a visual and immediately, like if we look at that before and after, it goes from being something that feels fairly harsh to something that feels just very sort of soft and muted. So bloom is going to have that effect. So anything in your scene that is bright, in particular things that are emissive, are going to really sort of be accentuated by having the bloom effect there. We've got a lot of different things we can customize with it. Again, we can customize how far it's spreading. So our diffusion, we can ramp that right down to effectively nothing. So there's a lot of different things that we can customize with this if we're wanting to. I'm going to turn off the color customization as well, and I'm going to bring that bloom down a little bit so it's not quite as ridiculous as it was before. So got ambient exposure, ambient occlusion, auto exposure, and bloom. Got a lot of other different ones as well. Chromatic aberration. This can be great if you're wanting to create sort of a visual distortion effect. And we can see mostly at the edges here. So chromatic aberration is going to cause color distortions. And it's going to be more accentuated typically at the edges, at the periphery of the scene. So I use that if I'm wanting, for things like where I'm trying to make it seem like there's more corruption or stuff like that happening. I'm going to turn off a couple of the effects. So it's good for sort of conveying things like that. Color grading, again, another really great one. You can use this for doing things like, well, what if I want to just warm up the entire scene? Or what if I want to cool down the entire scene? So you can very easily mess with stuff like that. You can also go really all in, where you can actually change how the different channels in that work. So you can do a post-processing effect that filters out everything except for a narrow range of colors, and everything else gets made grayscale. So I've done that previously with a game where you were having to, as you collected different things, you were able to see more of the color spectrum. And so I had different post-processing effects that would kick in that would be controlling which colors effectively came through. So you can go and entirely customize things like that with the color grading. So it's super powerful what you can do there with it. Depth of field, so that effect of things getting blurry with distance. And again, you can customize a lot of settings here, and you can have it so that it will be really blurry, or as you adjust the different ones, it's going to change where the particular focus is. You can change things like your aperture, which is all of these are going to then affect how our depth of field behaves. So that can be really handy if you're wanting things, for example, blurring in the long distance, or if you wanted to simulate blurring at different stages. So if you're wanting to have things there that are impacting the visuals like that by adding in some blurring. Could be when you're looking at something in the UI. For example, like if the character's holding up a notepad, you might want to then change the depth of field so everything behind them is blurring. So it's kind of creating that effect of, well, I'm focusing on this now, everything else is sort of defocused a bit. So outside of that, I can do things like film grain. And again, we've got our usual controls of intensity, and if we ramp up to really, really high intensity, and this will actually animate. If I play this, we'll see that the film grain does actually move, and we can control whether it's just black and white sort of film grain, so we can override that, and then it's just grayscale versus it being able to be full color range. We can change the size of the grains if we want it to be really, really, really blocky or just really minimal. So there's a lot of different things we can control there with that. Bring the intensity back to where it was before. And we'll turn that one off for now as well. So film grain, lens distortion, another handy one if you're wanting to do things like a sort of fisheye lens. These are things that you can easily do that using a lens distortion, and you can change where that distortion effect is occurring. So we can move the location of that quite easily. So again, it gives a lot of customization for what we want the behavior to be. Motion blur, we're not going to be able to easily see it with just a static scene, but as the name suggests, that's going to create that effect where motion is going to get sort of blurred and smeared across the screen. Screen space reflections, again a similar one where I would need to change rendering path. We haven't looked too much at that. I would need to use deferred rendering for that one. So for now, I'm just going to remove that one. And then the final one that anyone who knows me knows I am a huge fan of vignettes. I don't think I have released a solo game in years, or even a team game in years, that I have not added vignetting to. So vignetting does that. And I find just a subtle little bit of vignetting I actually am a big fan of. I feel it just sort of lessens sort of the intensity of the corners of the scene, and so helps just pull people's focus into the center. I am oh so much Team Vignette because it's so good. But that's setting up our post processing, and like it's really quick and easy to set the stuff up. They do have a performance cost, so that is a thing to be aware of. And when we're in the scene, we can be testing and see what it's going to look like. And it does make a very big difference in terms of the visuals. But there's more than we can do, more that we can do than just this. So this is our default post-processing volume. I can also then set up another one. So let me rename these a little bit. So this is upper cube, and I'm actually going to parent this to that. And then I'm going to rename this to EPV alternate. And my profile here, I'm going to duplicate this, and this is going to be the PPV alternate profile. So we'll link that up. So we've got two profiles here. Now, in terms of which one's active, we can control that with this idea of the weighting. But to be able to actually test that that's working, let's make our alternate profile really different. So the alternate profile, I'm going to, not chromatic aberration, I'm going to put in color grading with the alternate one, and I'm going to make it that it really shifts the temperature. So the thing it's going to be running into at the moment is I've got two volumes here that both have the same weight, both have the same priority. So what I could do is my default one, sorry, I leave it where it was, a weight of 1, and then the alternate one happens if I take the weight down to 0. We go back to the other one. So a really easy way of blending between the post-processing volumes is just to change the weighting of the different ones. So this is going to mean we have full weighting of the alternate, and the default one, we're not going to see any difference there. But the alternate is now fully weighted, so I can just by adjusting these weights, which I can really easily access in code, I can control which set of post-processing effects are being shown. So let me create an empty object here, and I'm just going to put it 0. And this is going to be my EPV switcher. So I'm going to use this and show you how we can do this switching between post-processing volumes in code. So we set this up here, PPV switcher. So we've got that. Excellent. So just want to make sure, so we've got our post-process volume. Now I need to be able to link to that, and I need to directly get this post-processing volume. So sometimes it can be hard to work out, well, what damn script do I refer to? So if I find the component, I can usually do edit script, and then that allows me to see the namespace firstly. So that means I know up here I can do using Unity Engine rendering post-processing, and I can then see it's called post-process volume. So it's an easy way if you're trying to track down what the actual class is. So volume 1, another one that's going to be volume 2. Because I love animation curves, I'm going to use an animation curve between the two to control that blending between them. So PPV blending, and then I want to control the time that this blend takes place over. Blend time, and I'm going to say over 5 seconds. So I'm going to then have my current time. Actually, I'm going to show you a slightly different way of how I usually track this. I'm going to have current progress. So then what I would be doing here is an update. Well, if current progress is less than 1, because I want this to be a 0 to 1 value, then I'd say current progress plus equals time.delta time divided by blend time. So this is just a way of having it go from 0 to 1 while still having it, have a blend time of however many seconds I want it to be. This is effectively just ticking up in a percentage value then. So update the progress if needed. And then to control the weighting, really straightforward. So volume 1, so its weight is going to be our blend curve evaluated at our current progress. Volume 2's weight is just going to be our 1 minus the volume 1 weight. So I just want these two to be opposites of each other. Now I'll do it. That will control fully the blending between the particular ones. And if I want to just ensure that from the very, very beginning these are set, then I can also do the same code in start. So let's link this up and make it do the switching between them. So I've got my switcher linked in the script, can link in my default and my alternate, and then let's just set up a curve. Let's go for an S-curve, except an S-curve the other way, because I want to go from my default to the alternate, so I want to actually have it start at 1 and go to 0. So that should do it. That should blend between these. And I'm going to actually select the alternate one so we can be watching the weighting there change. So we run up. Weighting is slowly changing, and we just see it blends seamlessly between the different ones. So really, really powerful for being able to set up these methods for post-processing. We can create our volumes, and then we can just blend between them by changing the weights. It is possible to change individual elements within this if we wanted to as well. It is not trivial code. It is absolutely not trivial code. It is something we will take a look at, potentially in this one, but it is not a trivial thing to be doing that. And it's messy looking code. Using different volumes is probably an easier way typically of doing it. Certainly a lot quicker to get up and running. So, okay, that's using that approach for the post-processing. And let's set up another version of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to duplicate this scene, just post-processing part 2. And we're going to switch to this one. Now this one, I'm going to get rid of the switcher. And what I'm going to do is these two volumes, before I'd set them to global, I'm going to take this off of being global. So now these are no longer global. You'll notice the post-processing effects have turned off. That's because the camera is outside of those boxes. So the post-processing effects I see, it's not based upon what objects are in that volume, it's based upon where the camera is in that volume. So I'm going to take this one and I'm going to offset it over here. And then this one, I'm going to offset the opposite way. And then my camera, what I'm going to do is rotate the camera like that. And we can see the camera's view here. So we've got no post-processing happening, none happening. And then we need to make sure we are properly in the volume and that it's looking for the right layer. And then if we also make sure we update the weighting. So now we can see that camera, as I move the camera, it is going to change. So the camera view there won't properly show the post-processing, but if I move the camera down there, then we'll be able to see. So we have no post-processing. Move into here, we suddenly do. As I move into the other volume, then we switch over to its version of the post-processing. So I'm going to rotate this back so we can see it this way. So we've got no post-process, well, sorry, the default. Then we move over here and we've got the other one. If we made these volumes overlap a little bit, so if we made that 4 and this -4, then look at what the camera does in that case. So we've got this one, it immediately switches. So we could, with the weighting of these, we could adjust the weighting a bit there and then see how that looks. So we go through, got the other one in there as well, and then it's a bit of a, so we've got a bit of both at this stage. And then, so we get a bit more of a smoother transition there between them. But so this is showing that effect of, well, okay, well, what if we want to have a specific set of effects in different areas? Then we can set up these volumes and that's going to allow us, just based upon where the camera is, to achieve this sort of effect. It's a really handy approach, but it's based upon where the camera is, not based upon what objects are in the volume. As soon as the camera is outside of the volume, the post-processing switches off. So it's just a way of working with it, just purely based upon the location. And you know, if I made it that this, let's position at -5, that's something where I could easily just animate switching between different locations here. And so I'm not having to hard code the switches in the post-processing volume. It just happens automatically because I've made sure I set the layer that it's looking in and I've made sure those volumes are in that layer. If I messed up and those volumes were just in default, then we see the post-processing turns off. So it needs to be in the actual post-processing layer. So okay, that's setting it up so we've got the post-processing working through the just a general camera, and that we have we can adjust it in code and we can have it adjusted based upon the camera location. Let's now set this up so we've also got this happening with Cinemachine and Timeline and see the different things that we can do there with that. Okay, so we're going to get our next scene set up. So this one is going to be a demo scene, and this is going to be Cinemachine and Timeline. We're going to just throw everything at it, because why not? So again, I want to set up my plane, and that's going to be like round, and then I'm going to make this larger. That's good. Make sure it's at the origin, and obviously give it a appropriate material. And then within the scene, I'm going to set up just a few different objects. So we're going to have a cube. I'm going to put at -5 and 5. I'm going to set up a sphere that I'll put at -5, 0, -5. That's also, for good measure, we will chuck in a cylinder that I will put at there. Just a few different things that I want to have in the scene. going to set up materials for these as well, just so that we've got a variety of colors in there, just so we can be seeing if how the effects appear with different things. That sphere, I'm going to make it a greenish color, like that. I'm also going to give the sphere a mission, just because I think that will work quite nicely when we start diving into some of the post-processing. And then we're going to have a cylinder, and let's change the color of the cylinder as well. Let's go for that's a good color. Perfect. All right, so we want to convert this over to using Cinemachine. So as always, we go down to, we create Cinemachine. So in this case, I am going to create a virtual camera. So this is going to be my overview camera. So we've done similar to this before. I'm going to position this at N, 10, 10. Rotation's not going to matter, because what I'm going to do is have this looking at the ground, like that. And turn off the body transposer. So we've got our overview camera, so that's cool. I'm going to set up a post-processing volume. And this, I'm going to put it in the post-processing layer. Now, one thing here, and this is actually reminds me of a bug I ran into. Post-processing volumes have a collider on them, because that's how they're working out their bounds. And they are a trigger. So if one of the other reasons for putting them in a separate layer, even if, as in this case, they're global ones, is those are a trigger, which means unless your raycasts are filtering out that layer, you might have them impact on that. And then that can cause some really hard to track down bugs. I have run into this myself. Really frustrating, really annoying. Eventually tracked it down, but that was not a fun time. So I'm going to set up my global post-processing. So this is going to be the post-processing that is going to be on the overall sort of scene. So this is going to be the post-processing volume for the overview camera. And so the way we link it up is, rather than, we could still set it up here on the main camera, but I'm actually going to put it on the virtual camera, and that's how I would normally set these up, is I put them on, when I'm using Cinemachine, the post-processing, I would do that on the virtual camera. That makes it really easy to have different post-processing on different virtual cameras. So to do that, extension-wise, I add in the Cinemachine post-processing, and I can just select my profile, so the overview camera, and then I can do that customization of it here. So the overview camera, I am going to say I want it to have a whole bunch of film grain, because I want it to look kind of like a security camera sort of thing. So I'm going to bring my game view up to here. It's going to make it easier for working with. So I want to have a fair bit of film grain on it. I'm also going to chuck in a color grading, because color grading, I can use that to desaturate stuff. So I can use it to lower the saturation there, like that. So the key thing I want to then be looking at with this is, okay, well, I'm not getting those visual effects appearing. Okay, so if we encounter this issue in Cinemachine, what's actually happening here is, so these post-processing volumes function as an override. They don't enable post-processing happening by default. So we still actually have to go to our main camera, and we still have to add in a post-processing layer on the main camera, where we set the volume layer again to post-processing, and then we can see that it's actually kicking in. And I can remove, actually I really kind of, that vignetting is really, I will scale it back, but I really love that level of vignetting. Sorry, just geeking out over how much I'm enjoying the vignetting in this. So we've got our overview camera that looks like that, which is pretty cool. So that's the key things. Our main camera has our actual setup in terms of the post-processing layer. Our post-processing volume, we can just actually switch that to our default profile. So that's now just in the scene. So if we turned off our post-processing on the overview camera, we just go back to the default. Otherwise, we're using the override, which looks quite cool. But let's set up another Cinemachine camera. So let's set up a dolly camera with track. This is going to be our orbit camera. This is going to be our orbit camera's track. And you'll see with that orbit camera, because I've added that in, it's going to be the default one. So it has reset back to the post-processing that the main scene is using. So let's set up some nice orbit points here. I'll make those like 15 and 15, and that one can be 15 and minus 15. And we'll just add in this one that can be minus 15 and minus 15. And then one last one at minus 15. That, and then we'll just say that it's looped. So that's pretty nice. Let's bring this up to that height. So we just want the camera to be moving around along that. And again, I'm just going to make it the focus target is the ground. So this one is going to be at the default point. Make it normalized so it'll move around like that. We want to give it different post-processing. So my Cinemachine one here, I want to have a separate set of processing for the orbit camera. So my orbit camera, again, I give it that extension, which I do apply add extension, and then that'll be my orbit camera one. Now this one, I don't want to have film grain or color grading. Vignetting, I want to lower that to a fairly light level of vignetting, maybe a little bit more than that, about 0.4. What I do want to add in though is I want to add in stuff like motion blur. So that we can adjust how many samples, that'll adjust sort of how it's reacting to the scene and to the movement there. So the level of effect, the color grading, I am going to leave as it is. Maybe I'll chuck in, what would be a good one to put in? I'm going to actually say that let's put in a little bit of lens distortion. It's not a lot, just a little bit, just enough. There we go. That's sort of an okay amount of lens distortion. So, okay, we'll have our orbit camera that will zoom around. So we've got two very different sets of post-processing because we've got the orbit camera and the overview cameras one, which look quite different. And then this is where I am going to set up a timeline for this to actually animate everything that's happening here in the scene. So timelines. So we're going to create a new timeline for demo scene in, and let's configure this timeline. So we're going to edit it. I prefer to edit them down here, but we'll be able to see how these actually work. So initial thing I need to do is I need to actually have my orbit camera moving along the track here. So we're in seconds, which is good. So all I want to do is my orbit camera, its position is starting at 0. Then over the course of, let's say, 10 seconds, I want it to get to a path position of 1. So it will slowly rotate around. That looks good. I want to blend between my cameras. So I'm going to have my main camera with a Cinemachine track. So what I want to do is I want to start with my orbit camera. And I'm going to have the orbit camera sit there for about 3 seconds. And then I'm going to switch to the overview camera. So I'm going to have the overview camera run from about 2 to maybe 5. Let's go 6 seconds. And then I'm going to switch back to the orbit camera for the final little bit. So what we should have is it goes through, it starts to switch over to that one. And then so we can change that post-processing as we're doing that blending between it. So it's just going to move around as it transitions. It adjusts the blending there. And this is one where I could set this demo scene to loop and then just run it, and then it will just do this forever. So this is a nice thing when you're using Cinemachine with Timeline. You can control this process of blending between the particular cameras and everything, and it'll also blend the post-processing effects, because we see those just nicely changing there between the different sort of setups there. And it's happening as it, so we see that vignette pull in, we see the vignette pull out. So it actually animates and blends not just the camera location, but also the post-processing effects. When we're using this with Cinemachine and Timeline, we get that really nice blending happening there, which is really powerful. So let's review the stuff with post-processing. And in particular, this is post-processing with the built-in pipeline. The process we used here is not what we would use with the universal pipeline or the high-def pipeline. Those do have a different setup for them. What we have seen is specifically for the built-in pipeline. So at our beginning one, we set up some volumes. So volumes are how we define the areas where a post-processing effect has actual influence. And post-processing can be tied to a location in the world, or we can have global ones. We can have multiple post-processing volumes set up, and we can switch between them based upon controlling their weight. So the weight determines whether a volume is active or not, or the strength of how active it is. When we've got our post-processing set up there, if it's not global, then whichever volume the camera is within is the volume where those effects are going to be being drawn from, which we saw in the part 2 one, where the camera location determines which of these sets of effects are applied. In the first one, we're manually controlling that in code by adjusting the weights. We also saw the key thing with post-processing is we need to be putting stuff in separate layers. That makes it a lot quicker in terms of being able to keep track of which volume stuff is in. Also lessens potential bugs from the fact that these volumes have triggers on them. So it means we're not going to inadvertently be picking them up if we're doing a raycast, if we haven't filtered by layer. So key things for setting up volumes. Global is where we want it to be an effect that's applying regardless of camera location. If it's not global, then that allows us to do things like, well, we want this effect in this room and this effect in this other room. So we can have different effects there like that. Post-processing also works with Cinemachine. When we're using it with Cinemachine, we still have our post-process layer set up on our main camera, but our virtual cameras can have their own set of post-processing that when that camera is active, then that profile will get also applied. That allows us to have just a general default of, yep, here's the global post-processing, here's the fallback one if there's not any special customization, but then here's the override one that we want the game to use with this specific camera. And we can set up timelines. where with the timeline, when it is actually blending between cameras, it will also blend between the post-processing effects. So we saw that where the vignetting comes in and then the vignetting fades out, and we see that those transitions happening there. So that's something where Cinemachine with Timeline, we get a really nice blending within the post-processing there. So in terms of the particular effects, the big thing I recommend there is just experimenting with the different effects. Experiment with the what the different effects do, because it's really the post-processing effects are about tone. They're about the visual aesthetic we're trying to convey for the game there. So they're not something where it's a case like, yes, here is the exact set of post-processing effects that this will make this good. You know, it's not a mathematical thing, it's a by feel. It's adjusting stuff to get the feel that you're after for it. Keep in mind that these effects do have a performance cost. So as you add in more effects, and some different effects will have different costs as well, they will add overhead to your game in terms of the performance there, but they can really draw together a scene, and they can really make the difference in terms of having something that plays well versus something that plays well and also has a really cohesive feel. So dive in, experiment with post-processing. It can really enhance your projects in a major way. And it's a lot of cool fun to actually play with, and very minimal code for working with it. So it's a pretty cheap win for being able to enhance a project. Thanks folks, that is all for this video. If you're looking for the project, you'll be able to find it up on GitHub, and I've put a link to that in the description below. If you've got any feedback, any questions, please chuck in a comment. And if you're looking to find ways to support the channel, chucking in a like or subscribing to the channel is always a big help. If you're looking to go further than that, then I do have a Patreon set up, and any support there is super appreciated. And there's a bunch of different things that you'll get as part of being a patron there. And the big thing is, it's going to help me make more cool things like this, which is going to help more people like yourself to be making more games, which is awesome. And that is all for now. Thank you.